The first 911 call came in at 11:47 p.m. A frantic whisper cut through the static, a voice begging for help before the line went dead. When officers from the local sheriff's department arrived at the location, they found nothing but the cold, imposing entrance to the old Briarcliff Tunnel, sealed shut with a wall of concrete that hadn't been touched in over 30 years. As more calls flooded the dispatch center over the next week, a chilling realization dawned on the investigators. The pleas for help were coming from inside a place no living person could possibly enter. When the tunnel was finally breached, the discovery inside would unravel a dark secret the town had buried long ago. For generations, the Briarcliff Tunnel was a local legend, a relic of a bygone railway era that snaked through the dense, unforgiving forests on the outskirts of town. Older residents spoke of it in hushed tones, recalling the tragic accident in the late 1980s that led to its permanent closure. A freight train had derailed deep within its suffocating darkness. A catastrophic event that claimed the lives of the crew and was so difficult to clean up that authorities decided to simply seal both ends with thick reinforced concrete, entombing the wreckage forever. The tunnel became a ghost story, a place for daring teenagers to test their courage by spray painting the concrete barrier, but nothing more. It was a closed chapter, a forgotten scar on the landscape. That is, until the screaming started. It began subtly. Residents living in the secluded properties near the tunnel's western entrance started reporting strange noises late at night. They described them as faint, echoing screams, easily dismissed as the cry of a fox or the wind whistling through the pines. But soon, the sounds grew more distinct, more human. The unease settled over the community like a thick fog, but without any evidence, authorities could do little. Then came the first 911 call. Over the course of one terrifying week, dispatchers received 12 separate calls, all traced by cellular triangulation to a signal originating from deep within the sealed Briarcliff Tunnel. The audio from these calls was the stuff of nightmares. Each recording captured the same desperate, terrified voice, punctuated by the sound of frantic, slapping footsteps on what sounded like wet ground, and chilling, guttural screams that seemed to echo off narrow, stone walls. The voice begged for someone named Jacob to wait, pleaded for help, and spoke of suffocating darkness and a crushing weight. The local sheriff's department was baffled. How could a cell phone be operating, let alone making calls, from inside a concrete tomb with no power and no signal reception? The case was handed over to state investigators, who approached the situation with a mix of scientific skepticism and growing dread. They analyzed the recordings, cross-referencing the vocal patterns and emotional distress markers. The voice was consistently identified as belonging to a young male, estimated to be in his late teens or early 20s. The terror in his voice was genuine. Investigators also delved into the history of the tunnel, unearthing the dusty files on the 1988 train derailment. The reports detailed the grim recovery efforts and the decision to seal the site, but one detail stood out. Among the 3 confirmed fatalities was a young brakeman named Jacob Reed. The name sent a shiver down the spine of even the most seasoned detectives. With public pressure mounting and the ghostly calls continuing, the engineering team made a decision. They would not demolish the entire concrete seal, but would instead drill a small, precise hole, just large enough to feed through a fiber optic camera. The process was slow and methodical. The drill bit ground against the decades-old concrete, the sound echoing through the silent woods where news crews and anxious locals had gathered. Finally, after hours of work, the drill broke through. A collective breath was held as the camera was carefully threaded into the abyss. The initial footage was disorienting. A world of absolute blackness, disturbed only by floating dust motes illuminated by the camera's tiny LED light. The engineers guided the lens deeper, panning across the cavernous space. The air inside was thick with the smell of rust and decay. Then, something came into view. Twisted, skeletal remains of the derailed freight cars lay strewn across the tunnel floor, exactly as the old reports had described. The camera moved past the wreckage, inching further down the tunnel. And that's when they saw it. Lying near a pool of stagnant water was a modern smartphone, its screen shattered but still faintly glowing. Beside it, investigators found the skeletal remains of a young man, clad in clothes that were clearly from the present day. In his hand, he clutched a small, leather-bound journal. The mystery of the calls from the dead had been solved, but a new, more sinister one had just begun. The remains were quickly identified as those of Ethan Hayes, a college student and amateur historian who had been reported missing 2 months prior. Ethan had been obsessed with local legends, and his journal, painstakingly recovered from the scene, detailed his final days. He had discovered a forgotten ventilation shaft, a narrow, crumbling brick-lined passage that led from the surface down into the sealed tunnel. Convinced he could find artifacts from the 1988 derailment, he had rappelled down into the darkness, his smartphone and a backpack full of supplies his only companions. The journal entries turned from excited discovery to sheer terror. On his second day inside, a section of the old ventilation shaft collapsed, sealing his only way out. He was trapped. His entries chronicled his descent into madness as his food and water dwindled, his flashlight died, and the crushing, absolute darkness began to play tricks on his mind. He wrote about hearing whispers, about seeing shapes move in the periphery of his vision. He became convinced he wasn't alone, that the ghost of Jacob Reed, the brakeman who died in the crash, was haunting him. His final, desperate 911 calls were not just pleas for rescue. They were screams of terror directed at a phantom his oxygen-starved brain had conjured in the tomb-like silence. He had been calling the dispatchers while screaming at a ghost. The intermittent signal, bouncing off mineral deposits in the rock, explained how his desperate calls had miraculously and tragically found their way out. However, the case took another, darker turn. The coroner's report on Ethan's remains revealed something the journal did not. While malnutrition and dehydration were the primary causes of death, there were also signs of a recent, non-fatal injury, a blunt force trauma to the back of the head, sustained shortly before he descended into the tunnel. Furthermore, an examination of the collapsed ventilation shaft showed that the collapse was no accident. The support beams had been deliberately sabotaged, weakened just enough to give way under the slightest pressure. Ethan Hayes had not just been trapped, he had been murdered. Investigators turned their attention back to the surface, to the people in Ethan's life. The journal mentioned his research partner, a fellow student named Liam Carter. When questioned, Liam was evasive. He initially claimed to know nothing of Ethan's plan to enter the tunnel, but phone records and witness statements placed him near the ventilation shaft on the day Ethan disappeared. Under intense interrogation, Liam's story crumbled. He confessed that he and Ethan had discovered something else during their research. The 1988 train derailment wasn't an accident either. The train had been carrying a shipment of undeclared industrial chemicals for a powerful local corporation. The accident had been staged by a disgruntled employee to expose the company's illegal dumping practices, but it went horribly wrong, leading to the deaths of the crew. Ethan, an idealist, wanted to expose the truth, to bring closure to the families and justice for the cover-up. Liam, however, saw an opportunity. He secretly contacted the now-defunct corporation's former CEO, an elderly and wealthy man still living in town, and attempted to blackmail him with the information. When Ethan discovered Liam's treachery and threatened to go to the police, Liam panicked. He lured Ethan to the tunnel under the pretense of one last exploration, struck him from behind, and left him for dead, knowing the shaft's collapse would seal his fate permanently. He never imagined his victim's final, desperate calls for help would echo out from the grave and expose his crime. When the truth was finally revealed, the case shook the town to its core. The ghost of Briarcliff Tunnel was not a spectral brakeman, but the lingering voice of a murdered boy, crying out for a justice he could not find in life. Liam Carter was arrested and charged with murder, and the aging CEO was indicted for his role in the decades-old cover-up. The tunnel, once a place of local folklore and tragedy, was permanently sealed, this time with the weight of a truth finally brought to light. The screams had stopped, but for the people of Briarcliff, the echoes of that terrible week would linger forever, a haunting reminder that some secrets refuse to stay buried.